The fluorescent lights of the Joint Base Lewis McChord headquarters hummed a monotonous tune, a constant low-level thrum that had become the background music to Sergeant First Class Melissa Hall's life. For 8 years, that hum had been a constant, a soundtrack to countless briefings, late-night duty rosters, and the quiet, simmering anxieties of military life. Today, however, the hum felt louder, more oppressive, pressing in on her as she stood at parade rest in the center of the commander's office. Commander Harrison Thorne was a man carved from granite and regulations. His uniform was a testament to order, not a single thread out of place, his silver hair cropped short in a style that hadn't changed since his days at West Point 30 years ago. He was known as a fair man, but a hard one. He believed in the unimpeachable authority of command, the rigid structure that held the chaos of the world at bay. He was currently reading a report, his face an unreadable mask. The silence in the room was a living thing, coiled and waiting to strike. Melissa could feel the weight of it on her chest. She knew what this was about. Yesterday's training exercise had been a disaster. A miscommunication in the field, a vital piece of equipment not delivered on time, and a squad had been left waiting in the mock combat zone for over an hour. The fault, according to the initial report filed by Lieutenant Davis, a man whose ambition often outpaced his integrity, lay squarely at her feet. He claimed she had failed to secure the necessary transport. Melissa hadn't failed. She had the time-stamped comm logs on her personal tablet to prove she'd sent the request, a request that Lieutenant Davis himself had sat on for 3 hours before approving it. But to bring that up would be to challenge a direct superior in an open forum, a breach of protocol that could end her career faster than any failed exercise. She was stuck, a pawn in a game where the rules were written by the people with the stars on their collars and the bars on their shoulders. Commander Thorne finally looked up, his eyes the color of slate fixed on her. They held no anger, not yet, just a cold, assessing disappointment that was somehow worse. "Sergeant Hall," his voice was a low rumble, the sound of stones grinding together. "This report is troubling. A lapse in judgment of this magnitude reflects poorly not just on you, but on your entire unit. On this command." Melissa's jaw tightened, but she held her position. "Yes, sir." "Explain yourself," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. It was a command, not an invitation. She took a breath, choosing her words with the care of a bomb disposal expert. "Sir, the requisition for the vehicles was submitted at 0500, as per the exercise protocol. I followed the standard chain of command." Thorne's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Lieutenant Davis's report states the request was never received until 0800, a mere 2 hours before the exercise was slated to begin. An impossible timeline." The trap was set. She could either agree with the lieutenant's false timeline and accept a punishment that would likely include a letter of reprimand in her permanent file, stalling any hope of promotion for years, or she could contradict him, forcing an investigation that would put her at odds with her direct superior and create a toxic work environment she'd have to endure every single day. "Sir, with all due respect to Lieutenant Davis, Thorne held up a hand, silencing her. His patience, it seemed, was at an end. He stood up, a slow, deliberate movement that emphasized his height and authority. He walked around his massive mahogany desk, the sound of his polished shoes sharp against the linoleum floor. He stopped a few feet from her, his presence overwhelming. "You will address the accusation directly, Sergeant. Did you, or did you not, fail in your duty to secure the necessary equipment in a timely manner?" Melissa felt a hot spike of injustice. This wasn't an inquiry, it was an interrogation. He had already decided. In his mind, the word of a lieutenant, an officer, was inherently more credible than that of a non-commissioned officer. It was the way the world worked. It was the way his world worked. He took another step closer. And then, he did something so bizarre, so utterly out of character, that for a moment, Melissa thought she was hallucinating. He reached out and, with a firm but not painful grip, took hold of a lock of her dark hair that had escaped from her tight bun. He pulled it. Not hard enough to hurt, but with enough force to be an unmistakable gesture of dominance, of control. It was a physical assertion of his rank, a silent, shocking message that said, "I own this space, I own this moment, and in this moment I own you." The air in the room vanished. Melissa's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the individual strands of hair being pulled taut against her scalp. This wasn't in any manual. This wasn't a recognized form of military discipline. This was something raw, primal, and deeply inappropriate. It was the kind of act you'd expect from a playground bully, not from the commanding officer of a major military installation. For a split second, the world tilted. She saw Lieutenant Davis's smug, imagined face. She saw the years of silent struggle to be heard, to be respected in a world that often saw her as just another cog in the machine. And she saw the absolute, unquestioning authority embodied in the man standing before her, an authority she had spent her entire adult life learning to obey without question. Everything in her training screamed at her to remain still, to endure, now to let this bizarre and humiliating moment pass, to be a good soldier, to not make waves. But in that same split second, something else stirred deep within her. A tiny, fierce ember that refused to be extinguished by protocol or fear. It was the ember of her own dignity. The commander wasn't just questioning her competence anymore, he was attacking her person. He had crossed a line so fundamental that it existed outside the military code. He had touched her without consent, in a way that was designed not to correct, but to demean. Time seemed to freeze. She could feel the weight of his gaze, expecting her to flinch, to apologize, to crumble. He was waiting for the standard response, the bowed head, the mumbled, "Yes, sir." He was waiting for his authority to be reaffirmed. Instead, our Melissa Hall did something that would be whispered about in the mess halls and barracks for years to come. She didn't pull away. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She did the one thing he never expected. She turned her head very slowly so that she was looking directly into his eyes, and in a voice as calm and steady as the hum of the fluorescent lights, she spoke. Her reaction was not one of submission, but of a quiet, profound challenge that would send shockwaves through the entire base, leaving everyone, including the commander himself, utterly stunned. The ember within her had ignited, and the fire was about to change everything. Her eyes, a deep, steady brown, locked onto his. There was no fear in them, no anger, not yet. Just a profound, unsettling calm. The kind of calm that settles over a battlefield just before the first shot is fired. Her voice, when it came, was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the humming silence like a blade. "Sir," she said, her tone perfectly level, betraying no emotion. "Are you aware that you are currently pulling my hair?" The question hung in the air, absurd and devastating. It was the simple, undeniable truth, stated with the clinical detachment of a logistics report. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a plea. It was a simple observation that reframed the entire dynamic. It took his act of raw, unspoken power and dragged it into the harsh, undeniable light of fact. For the first time in his career, Commander Harrison Thorne was speechless. His hand, which had been so sure a moment before, now felt like a foreign object, a grotesque appendage. And he saw what he was doing as if for the first time, through her eyes. He saw the absurdity of it, the ugliness of it. The granite mask of his face cracked, just a fraction. A flicker of confusion, of something akin to shame, passed through his slate-gray eyes. His hand released her hair as if it had been burned. He took a half-step back, the space between them now filled with a new kind of tension, one he couldn't control with a regulation or a reprimand. Melissa didn't move. She didn't smooth her hair back into place. She simply continued to hold his gaze. She had stated a fact. The ball was now in his court. The silence that followed was no longer oppressive. It was expectant. It was his move. He cleared his throat, a rough, grating sound. "Sergeant Hall, He started, his voice lacking its usual commanding timbre. He faltered. Well, what could he say? That he was asserting his authority? It sounded pathetic, even in his own head. That it was a test of her composure? A lie he wouldn't even believe himself. He retreated behind his desk, a physical barrier he desperately needed. He sat down heavily, the leather chair creaking in protest. He looked down at the report on his desk, but the words were just a meaningless blur. He saw only her eyes, calm and questioning. "You may go, Sergeant," he finally managed, his voice hollow. It was not a dismissal of a subordinate. It was the retreat of a man who had been utterly disarmed. Melissa executed a perfect regulation about face and walked to the door. Her hand was on the cool metal knob when his voice stopped her. "Sergeant Hall." She paused, not turning around. The transport request. You're certain you submitted it at 0500?" A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her mouth. She had not had to file a complaint. She had not had to utter a single word of accusation against Lieutenant Davis. She had simply held up a mirror, and in it, the commander had seen not just her, but the ugliness of his own action and perhaps the larger ugliness of a situation built on unthinking assumption. He was asking the right question. It was a start. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice still calm. "I have the time-stamped logs on my personal tablet if you'd like to review them, sir." Another beat of silence. "That won't be necessary," he said quietly. "Dismissed." She opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, closing it softly behind her. The hum of the lights was there, but it sounded different now. Lighter. A somehow. She leaned against the wall for just a moment, her heart finally beginning to pound a wild, erratic rhythm against her ribs. She had done it. She hadn't planned it. It had been pure instinctive reaction, a refusal to be diminished. She had no idea what the fallout would be. She had just spoken to a full-bird colonel in a way that no one spoke to a full-bird colonel. She had effectively called him out on an act of physical intimidation. Her career could be over. She could be transferred to a remote listening post in Alaska. She could face retaliation. But as she pushed off from the wall and walked down the corridor, past young privates who snapped to attention, she felt a strange, exhilarating sense of peace. Whatever happened next, she had not bent. For one singular moment, she had looked power in the eye and without a word of challenge, had made it blink first. The news, as it always does in the close-knit world of a military base, traveled with the speed and unpredictability of a wildfire. It started as a whisper. A clerk who had been walking past the commander's office swore he heard a strange, prolonged silence. Then, a junior officer who saw Sergeant Hall emerge from the office, pale but composed, and the commander call her back in an uncharacteristically muted tone. The whispers grew, mutated. By the time the afternoon shift change occurred, the story had taken on a life of its own. In the enlisted personnel's barracks, the tale was one of heroic defiance. "She just stared him down," Private First Class Miller said, his eyes wide as he recounted the story to a rapt audience in the common room. "The old man, the big, scary commander. And she just looked at him and asked him if he knew he was pulling her hair. Can you imagine?" It was a story of the powerless finding a voice, of David facing Goliath not with a sling, but with a perfectly worded question. In the officers' mess, the narrative was different, more troubling. It was discussed in hushed, concerned tones over cups of coffee. "It's a matter of protocol," Captain Evans said, stirring his coffee with a frown. Regardless of what happened, the chain of command must be respected. If NCOs start questioning officers in their own offices, where does it end? For them, it was a story that threatened the very foundation of their world, a story of chaos poking its head through the cracks of order. And for Commander Thorne, it was a story he couldn't escape. He sat in his quarters that night. The silence of his home, a stark contrast to the ordered noise of his office. He replayed the scene in his mind over and over. The look in her eyes, the simple, devastating question. He was a man who prided himself on his control, his judgment, and he had made a catastrophic error. He had let a moment of frustration over a lieutenant's petty failing, a moment of impatience with what he perceived as insubordination, manifest itself in a physical act that was beneath his rank, beneath his dignity, beneath his own personal code. The next morning, the atmosphere at the base was electric. Everyone knew something had happened, but no one knew the official outcome. Melissa walked into her office, acutely aware of the glances thrown her way. Some admiring, some wary, some simply curious. She sat at her desk, booting up her computer, and trying to focus on the mountain of paperwork that had accumulated. Her phone rang. It was the commander's adjutant. "Sergeant Hall, the commander requests your presence in his office at 0900 hours. The call was expected, but it still sent a jolt through her. She walked the now familiar path to his office, her footsteps steady on the linoleum. This time, when she entered, Lieutenant Davis was there. He stood off to the side, his usual smugness replaced by a tight, anxious look. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Commander Thorne was behind his desk, but he looked different. The granite facade was still there, but it seemed weathered, tired. "Sergeant Hall, thank you for coming," he said, his voice formal but not cold. He gestured to a chair. "Please, sit down." She sat, surprised by the gesture. It was the first time she had ever been invited to sit in his office. He then turned his gaze to Lieutenant Davis. "Lieutenant, I have reviewed the communications logs provided by Sergeant Hall. They clearly show the transport request was submitted at 5:03 on the morning of the exercise." Lieutenant Davis's face paled. He opened his mouth, but the commander held up a hand, a mirror of the gesture he had used to silence Melissa just 24 hours before. The irony was not lost on her. "Your report was, at best, a gross misrepresentation of the facts, and at worst, a deliberate falsehood designed to shift blame from your own negligence," Thorne continued, his voice hardening with each word. "I will be filing a formal letter of reprimand that will be placed in your permanent file. Furthermore, you are hereby relieved of your duties as platoon leader and reassigned to administrative support, effective immediately. You will clear out your desk by noon. Dismissed." Lieutenant Davis looked like he had been physically struck. He glanced at Melissa, a look of pure hatred flashing in his eyes before he quickly masked it. He executed a stiff salute, which the commander returned, and walked out of the office, his world collapsing around him. The door clicked shut, leaving Melissa and Commander Thorne alone once more. The silence this time was different. It was not hostile, not charged. It was simply quiet. The commander leaned forward, placing his forearms on the desk. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw the man behind the rank. He looked weary, but also relieved. "Sergeant Hall," he began, his voice low. I asked you here for 2 reasons. The first was to ensure you witnessed the correction of the official record. Your performance in that exercise was exemplary. The failure was not yours." "Thank you, sir," she said softly. He nodded, then took a deep breath. This was clearly the harder part. "The second reason is to apologize." The words seemed to cost him a great deal. "My behavior yesterday was unprofessional, inappropriate, and completely unbecoming of an officer in the United States Army. There is no excuse for it. I allowed frustration to compromise my judgment, and I took that out on you in a way that was utterly wrong. I am sorry." Melissa looked at him. She saw a proud man humbling himself, not because he was ordered to, but because he knew it was the right thing to do. It was an act of courage, in its own way. As profound as her own the day before. She could have accepted his apology coolly, maintaining the distance between them. But she chose a different path. "I appreciate that, sir," she said, her voice genuine. "Truly." She paused. "I wasn't trying to be insubordinate yesterday. I couldn't let that moment define me." He met her gaze, and this time there was understanding in his eyes. "It didn't," he said quietly. "It defined me. It showed me something I needed to see." He leaned back. "I've also requested a full review of our equipment requisition protocols. Lieutenant Davis's ability to single-handedly stall an operation exposed a flaw in the system. We'll be implementing a digital audit trail with automatic flagging for delays. Your quick thinking and your adherence to the facts has likely saved other units from similar failures in the future." Melissa was stunned. Her quiet act of defiance was not only clearing her name, but was leading to a systemic change that would benefit everyone. She had walked into his office as a potential scapegoat and was walking out as a catalyst for reform. Over the following weeks, the whispers on the base changed again. They spoke of how Sergeant Hall, the woman who wouldn't bend, was now being consulted by the commander on new training protocols. They spoke of how the toxic culture in the logistics department was being dismantled piece by piece. They saw Lieutenant Davis now relegated to filing paperwork in a basement office, a ghost of his former arrogant self. The story was no longer just about a single, shocking moment. It was about the aftermath. It was about a commander who had the humility to learn from his mistake and the integrity to make it right. It was about a sergeant who, by simply holding on to her truth, had sparked a change that rippled far beyond her own career. One afternoon, about a month after the incident, Melissa was walking across the parade ground. The sun was warm on her face. She saw Commander Thorne approaching from the opposite direction. As they drew near, he stopped. "Sergeant Hall," he said, a genuine, if small, smile touching his lips for the first time in their acquaintance. It transformed his severe face. "How are the new protocol revisions coming along?" "Very well, sir," she replied. "The training sessions start next week. I think it's going to make a real difference." "I'm sure it will," he said. He looked at her for a moment, and his expression thoughtful. "You know, in all my years of service, I've given a lot of orders and received a lot of reports. But I think the most important lesson I've learned in recent memory came from you. It wasn't about a regulation or a protocol. It was about the simple power of stating a fact without fear or favor." He offered a slight nod, a gesture of profound respect between equals, and continued on his way. Melissa stood there for a moment, watching him go. She thought back to that moment in his office, the sharp pull on her scalp, the chilling silence. She remembered the tiny, fierce ember that had ignited within her, the one that refused to be snuffed out. She hadn't planned to start a revolution. She had only planned to hold on to her own dignity. But in doing so, she had reminded a powerful man of his own humanity, and in the process, had helped make their small corner of the world a little bit better, a little bit fairer. She turned and walked towards her own office, the sun warm on her back, the hum of the base no longer an oppressive drone, but the sound of a machine that was finally beginning to work just a little bit more smoothly. Her hair, now neatly tucked back into its bun, was her own. And her story, the one they would whisper about for years, was not just about the moment the commander pulled her hair. It was about the moment she found her voice and the unexpected, powerful change that followed. It was a story not of rebellion, but of profound, quiet revolution. And it was just the beginning.